The morning Uncle Kenneth showed up at my Denver apartment with legal papers claiming Grandpa's inheritance was rightfully his, I thought losing everything was the worst thing that could happen to me. 3 months later, standing in a sun-drenched adobe kitchen in New Mexico, kneading dough with hands that had learned the ancient rhythm of traditional bread making, I realized that sometimes the cruelest betrayals lead to the most beautiful discoveries. When family takes what you think defines you, you might just find out who you really are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The knock on my apartment door came at 7 in the morning, sharp and insistent like everything else about Uncle Kenneth. I stumbled from my bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes from another late night at the accounting firm where I'd been slowly suffocating for the past 8 years. Through the peephole, I could see my father's younger brother standing in the hallway, his expensive suit immaculate despite the early hour, a leather briefcase clutched in his manicured hands. "Kenneth?" I opened the door, confused. We hadn't spoken since Grandpa Henry's funeral 6 months earlier, where he'd made pointed comments about young people expecting handouts while glaring at me across the cemetery. "What are you doing here?" His smile was razor thin as he pushed past me into my modest living room, his eyes scanning the thrift store furniture and discount art prints with obvious disdain. "We need to talk, Natalie, about your grandfather's will." The coffee mug in my hand suddenly felt heavy. Grandpa Henry had been the only family member who truly understood me, who encouraged my childhood dreams of opening a bakery before practical concerns and family pressure steered me toward the safety of corporate accounting. When his lawyer had read the will, I'd been shocked to learn he'd left me his house in some tiny New Mexico town I'd never heard of, along with a modest savings account. "The will's already been settled," I said carefully, setting down my mug. The lawyer explained everything. Kenneth's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That's where you're wrong." He opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, withdrawing a thick stack of documents. "You see, your grandfather wasn't of sound mind in his final years. The family has decided to challenge the will. This inheritance should go to his children, not his grandchildren. It should go to me." The papers he thrust toward me swam before my eyes as I tried to process the legal language. Words like mental incapacity and undue influence jumped out at me, along with what appeared to be medical records and witness statements I'd never seen before. "This is ridiculous," I managed, though my voice came out smaller than intended. Grandpa was sharp until the end. He knew exactly what he was doing. Did he? Kenneth's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Because according to these medical evaluations, he was showing signs of dementia for over 2 years. And according to these witness statements from Derek and Patricia, you were spending an unusual amount of time with him toward the end, possibly influencing his decisions. My cousin Derek appeared in the doorway then, as if summoned by his father's word. At 35, he possessed the same cold calculation as his father, but wrapped in a veneer of false concern that made him somehow worse. "Hey cousin," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry about all this legal stuff, but you understand we have to protect the family's interests." "Protect the family's interests?" I repeated, anger finally cutting through my shock. "Grandpa wanted me to have that house. He told me stories about it, about the town where he grew up. He said it would give me a chance to follow my dreams instead of rotting away in some corporate job." Derek exchanged a meaningful look with his father. "See? That's exactly what we're talking about. Undue influence. You obviously planted ideas in his head about this supposed dream of yours." "It wasn't supposed," I snapped. "I've wanted to open a bakery since I was 12 years old. Grandpa was the only one who supported that dream." "Dreams don't pay bills," Kenneth said dismissively, the same phrase he'd used to crush my spirits at family gatherings for years. "Your grandfather may have indulged your fantasies, but the adults in this family have responsibility. That property is worth considerable money, money that should support his actual children, not fund some childish whim." The casual cruelty of reducing my deepest passion to a childish whim hit me like a physical blow. These were the same people who'd spent years telling me I was impractical, that I needed to be more realistic, that I should be grateful for my stable job even if it made me miserable. "The legal process has already begun," Derek added, pulling out his phone to check messages with studied nonchalance. "Our lawyer says it's pretty straightforward. Elderly man with documented cognitive decline, influenced by a granddaughter who stood to benefit financially. The court will see right through it." "But the lawyer said," the probate lawyer, Kenneth interrupted with another cold laugh. "He was just doing his job reading what was written. He's not going to fight a family contest, especially not for someone who can't afford extended legal fees. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I made $42,000 a year at a job that barely covered my Denver rent and student loans. Kenneth owned 3 successful restaurants and a catering business. Derek worked in tech sales and drove a car worth more than I made in 2 years. The legal playing field wasn't just uneven, it was practically vertical. How long do I have? I asked quietly, hating how defeated I sounded. The injunction goes into effect immediately, Kenneth said, sliding more papers across my coffee table. You can't take possession of the property or access the accounts until this is resolved. And realistically, Natalie, this could take years to work through the courts. Years you can't afford. Derek leaned back against my doorframe, clearly enjoying my distress. Look, we're not unreasonable people. Once this gets sorted out and the property comes to Dad like it should have in the first place, maybe we can work out something small for you. A few thousand, maybe, enough for a nice vacation or something. The condescension in his voice made my teeth clench. A few $1,000s from property worth hundreds of thousands, offered like a charitable donation to keep me quiet while they stole my grandfather's final gift. After they left, I sat on my couch staring at the legal documents until the words blurred together. My phone rang several times, coworkers wondering why I wasn't at the office, friends making plans I couldn't afford to join, but I let everything go to voicemail. The walls of my small apartment seemed to press closer with each passing hour, reminding me of how trapped I'd become. That evening, I found myself digging through the cardboard box where I kept Grandpa's personal effects, things I'd rescued from his Denver house before Kenneth and Patricia swooped in to claim everything valuable. Most of it was mundane, old photographs, reading glasses, a worn leather wallet, but at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, I found something I'd forgotten about. It was a small wooden recipe box, hand-carved with intricate patterns that spoke of patient craftsmanship. Inside, written in Grandpa's careful script, were dozens of recipe cards for bread, pastries and traditional Mexican sweets. But tucked behind the recipes was a folded piece of paper I'd never seen before, with my name written on the outside in his distinctive handwriting. My dear Natalie, the letter began, if you're reading this, it probably means someone is trying to take away what I left you. I've been watching Kenneth and Derek for years, and I know they see dollar signs where I see possibility. By now they've probably convinced you that you can't fight them, that you don't have the resources or the strength. They're wrong. My hands trembled as I continued reading. The property in San Miguel de Valle isn't just a house, sweetheart. It's a bakery waiting to be born. The adobe building has traditional bread ovens that my grandfather built in 1892, ovens that still work perfectly. The land has fruit trees and space for a garden. Most importantly, the town has people who remember what it means to support each other's dreams, instead of crushing them. I know you're scared. I know the corporate world has beaten down your spirit and made you forget how brave you used to be. But you are Henry Brooks' granddaughter, and we don't give up when bullies try to take what's ours. There's something they don't know about that property, something I never put in the will because I wanted you to discover it yourself. When you get to San Miguel de Valle, look for the old wooden chest in the root cellar behind the main house. Inside you'll find everything you need to fight back and build the life you've always wanted. The letter was signed with a shaky H, and followed by a postscript that made tears spring to my eyes. Trust Rosa Delgado, at the Adobe Bakery. She's been waiting for you. I read the letter 3 more times before the full implications sank in. Grandpa had anticipated this betrayal. Somehow he'd known that Kenneth would try to steal my inheritance, and he'd prepared for it. The mention of Rosa Delgado sent a chill of recognition through me. Grandpa had mentioned her in stories about his childhood, describing her as the best baker in 3 counties, and one of the kindest people he'd ever known. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling between despair and a growing spark of something that felt dangerously like hope. By morning I'd made a decision that would have terrified the old Natalie, the one who'd spent years playing it safe and following other people's expectations. I called in sick to work, then spent the day researching bus routes to New Mexico. A Greyhound ticket to Santa Fe would cost most of my remaining paycheck, but from there I could catch a local bus to San Miguel de Valle. It wasn't a plan exactly, more like a desperate leap into the unknown. But Grandpa's letter had awakened something in me that years of corporate drudgery had nearly smothered. The memory of who I used to be before fear and family pressure convinced me to settle for safety. The hardest part was packing. Everything I owned fit into 2 duffel bags and a backpack, a depressing reminder of how small my life had become. I left behind the business suits that had become my daily uniform, keeping only jeans, t-shirts, and the few items that still connected me to dreams I'd buried long ago. The recipe box went into my backpack along with the letter, my laptop, and what little money I had left after buying the bus ticket. As I locked my apartment door for what I suspected might be the last time, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Dad's lawyer filed the paperwork today. Hope you're not planning anything stupid. This will be over soon and we can all move on. The casual cruelty of that message, the assumption that I would simply roll over and accept their theft, ignited something fierce in my chest. I deleted the text without responding and shouldered my bag. Kenneth and Derek thought they'd won because they had money and lawyers and the comfortable assumption that I was too weak to fight back. They were about to discover they'd made a serious miscalculation. The Greyhound station at dawn was a liminal space filled with people in transition, workers heading to early shifts, travelers escaping old lives or chasing new ones.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Wanderers carrying their stories in worn backpacks and battered suitcases. I bought coffee from a vending machine and found a seat near the window, watching Denver's skyline fade into memory as our bus pulled onto the highway. The journey to Santa Fe took 8 hours, winding through landscapes that gradually transformed from urban sprawl to high desert punctuated by red rock formations and endless sky. With each mile I felt something loosening in my chest, as if invisible cables that had been constraining my breathing were finally beginning to snap. My phone buzzed occasionally with work emails and messages from friends, but I left them unanswered. That version of my life was already becoming a story about someone else. In Santa Fe, I transferred to a smaller bus that served the rural communities scattered throughout northern New Mexico. The other passengers were mostly locals, elderly women carrying shopping bags, workers heading home from town jobs, teenagers with earbuds and bored expressions. They glanced at me curiously, clearly recognizing an outsider, but their looks weren't unfriendly. More like they were wondering what story had brought a young woman with 2 duffel bags and nervous energy to their corner of the world. San Miguel de Valle announced itself with a faded wooden sign that listed the population as. The bus stop was nothing more than a weathered bench beside a small grocery store, the driver calling out, "This is it, miss," before my feet had fully touched the ground. As the bus disappeared around a bend, leaving me alone with my bags in the thin mountain air, I had my first moment of serious doubt about the wisdom of this impulsive journey. The town stretched along both sides of a narrow valley, adobe buildings the color of desert sand clustered around a central plaza where ancient cottonwood trees provided blessed shade. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still touched with snow despite the warming spring weather. Everything felt different here. The quality of light, the pace of movement, the way sound carried in the thin air. It was beautiful in a stark, uncompromising way that made Denver's glass and steel seem artificial by comparison. I shouldered my bags and started walking toward what appeared to be the town center, passing small houses with hand-carved wooden doors and gardens where early vegetables were already sprouting in neat rows. A few people working in their yards looked up to nod politely, their expressions curious but welcoming. Children played in dusty side streets, their laughter echoing off adobe walls, while dogs dozed in whatever shade they could find. The adobe bakery sat on one corner of the main plaza, its hand-painted sign depicting a traditional bread oven surrounded by wheat stalks and chili peppers. Through the front window, I could see wooden shelves lined with loaves, pastries, and what looked like traditional Mexican sweetbread. The aroma drifting from the open door made my stomach clench with hunger and something deeper, recognition, as if some ancestral memory was awakening after years of dormancy. I stood outside for several minutes, trying to work up the courage to enter. What if Rosa Delgado had no idea who I was? What if Grandpa's letter had been the confused rambling of an old man and I'd just traveled 800 miles based on false hope? What if Kenneth and Derek were right, and I was just a naive dreamer chasing fantasies instead of facing reality? Before I could lose my nerve entirely, the bakery door opened, and a woman emerged, wiping flour-dusted hands on a worn apron. She was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When she saw me standing there with my bags, those eyes softened with something that looked remarkably like recognition. "Natalie?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that made my name sound musical. Natalie Brooks? I nodded, too surprised to speak. She smiled then, an expression of such genuine warmth that tears sprang to my eyes. Misha, she said, opening her arms. Henry told me you'd come eventually, but I wasn't sure when. Welcome home. The hug she enveloped me in smelled of cinnamon and yeast, flour, and something indefinably comforting that I later learned was the scent of wood-fired ovens and generations of love baked into every loaf. For the first time since Uncle Kenneth had appeared at my door with his legal papers and cold threats, I felt like I could breathe fully. You knew I was coming, I managed when she finally released me. Rosa's laugh was rich and knowing. Your grandfather wrote to me every month for 40 years. The last letter came 2 weeks before he died, telling me to watch for a lost granddaughter who would need to remember how to find herself. He said you'd arrive when the family vultures finally showed their true color. The casual way she dismissed Kenneth and Derek as vultures, combined with the matter-of-fact acceptance of my arrival, made something tight in my chest finally begin to unwind. Here was someone who understood, who had been prepared for this moment, who saw my journey not as running away but as coming home. Come, Rosa said, reaching for one of my bags. Carlos is in the back, finishing the afternoon baking. You're probably hungry, and we have much to talk about. The interior of the Adobe bakery was exactly what I dreamed bakeries should be, warm and welcoming, with rough-hewn wooden shelves displaying an array of breads and pastries that made my mouth water. The walls were thick adobe, keeping the space cool despite the heat from the ovens, and small windows let in filtered sunlight that seemed to make everything glow. Behind the main shop I could see into the kitchen area where a man with graying hair and powerful forearms was sliding loaves from a traditional wood-fired oven. Carlos, Rosa called, come meet Henry's granddaughter. The man who emerged from the kitchen looked like he'd stepped from a folk tale about master craftsmen. His hands were dusted with flour, his face weathered by years of early mornings and honest work. When he smiled, his whole face transformed, radiating the kind of contentment that comes from doing work you love in a place you belong. So you're the famous Natalie, he said, his handshake firm and calloused. Your grandfather talked about you constantly in his letter. The granddaughter who inherited his love of baking but got lost in the corporate world. I'm not lost anymore, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. At least I hope I'm not. Rosa and Carlos exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicate volumes without words. Then Rosa disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a plate of still warm bread and a bowl of what looked like green chili stew. Eat first, she said, settling me at a small table near the window. Then we'll talk about why you're really here and what your grandfather left for you to find. The bread was unlike anything I'd tasted, dense and nutty, with a crust that had been kissed by wood smoke and a crumb that spoke of ancient grains and patient fermentation. The stew was complex and warming, with layers of flavor that seemed to tell stories about the land where the childs had grown and the hands that had prepared them. As I ate, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me, as if my body was remembering what real food was supposed to taste like. Your grandfather's property is about 2 miles up the valley, Carlos said once I'd finished eating. The house hasn't been lived in for 15 years, not since the Martinez family moved to Albuquerque, but it's solid adobe construction, built to last. Henry made sure the taxes were always paid, Rosa added, and he hired local kids to keep the weeds down and check on things. The bread ovens are in perfect condition. Carlos helped restore them 3 years ago when your grandfather visited for the last time. He came, I asked, surprised. He never mentioned visiting. Every spring for 40 years, Rosa said with a smile. He'd stay for a week, help with the spring planting, share stories about Denver and about you. The last time he was already getting frail, but he insisted on checking the ovens one more time, said his granddaughter was going to need them soon. The casual way they spoke about Grandpa's expectations, as if my eventual arrival had been a foregone conclusion rather than a desperate gamble, continued to astonish me. These people had been waiting for me, preparing for me, believing in a future I'd barely dared to imagine.
There's something else, Carlos said, his expression growing more serious. Your grandfather mentioned that family members might try to cause trouble. He left instructions with our lawyer about how to handle any challenges to your ownership. You have a lawyer here? I asked, hope flickering in my chest. Rosa laughed. Misha, this is a small town, but we're not primitive. Isabella Santos handles legal matters for half the valley. She's also the best artist in 3 counties and makes the finest pottery you've ever seen. You'll like her. As if summoned by the mention of her name, the bakery door chimed and a woman in her mid-30s entered, paint-stained denim jacket over a flowing skirt, silver earrings catching the afternoon light. Her black hair was streaked with premature silver and pulled back in an elaborate braid, and her dark eyes held the kind of intelligence that missed nothing. "Is this our famous refugee from the corporate world?" she asked, extending a hand that was strong despite being delicate. "Isabella Santos, but everyone calls me Izzy. I've been handling your grandfather's affairs for the past 5 years. You know about the legal challenge?" I asked, hope and anxiety warring in my chest. Izzy's smile was sharp and confident. "Kenneth Brooks called my office yesterday trying to intimidate me with threats about interfering with family business. I told him that New Mexico doesn't recognize legal challenges from Colorado unless they're properly filed through our courts, which his aren't. But he has medical records, witness statements. He has Colorado papers that hold no weight here," Izzy interrupted. "More importantly, your grandfather was very thorough about documenting his mental capacity right up until his death. We have medical evaluations, sworn statements from local witnesses, and most importantly, a series of detailed letters explaining exactly why he wanted you to inherit that property." The relief that washed over me was so intense I felt lightheaded. "So Kenneth can't take—" "Not legally," Izzy said. "Though that doesn't mean he won't try other forms of pressure. Bullies like your uncle don't give up easily when they think money is involved." "Speaking of which," Rosa interjected, "we should get you settled at the property before it gets dark. The house needs some work, but it's livable, and you'll want to see what your grandfather left in the root cellar." The short drive to my inherited property took us through landscapes that looked like something from a dream: rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon pine, distant mountains painted purple by the late afternoon sun, glimpses of an Aizqua irrigation ditch lined with young cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. Carlos drove while Rosa pointed out landmarks and neighbors, their easy familiarity with every curve and vista making it clear this was home in the deepest sense. The property sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, surrounded by fruit trees that were just beginning to bud in what had once been vegetable gardens now gone to prairie grass. The main house was traditional adobe, single-story with a flat roof and vigas extending from the walls, the whole structure glowing golden in the late sunlight. Attached to one side was a larger building that Rosa explained had been used for grain storage and food preparation. "The bread ovens are in there," she said, pointing to a larger structure. "2 of them traditional Horno design. Your great-great-grandfather knew what he was doing when he built them." But it was the smaller structure behind the main house that captured my attention, a low adobe building that seemed to grow from the earth itself, with thick walls and a heavy wooden door secured by an iron latch that looked centuries old. "That's the root cellar," Carlos said, following my gaze. "Your grandfather was very specific about that being the first place you should look." The heavy door opened with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing steps that descended into cool darkness. Carlos produced a flashlight from his truck, and we made our way carefully down stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, with deep alcoves cut into the walls for storing vegetables and preserves. But in the center of the space sat a wooden chest that looked like it belonged in a pirate story, bound with iron straps and secured with a lock that had clearly been opened recently. "Your grandfather left us the key," Rosa said quietly, producing it from her pocket. "He said to tell you that this chest contains everything the vultures don't know about, everything they can't take away." My hands shook as I turned the key and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents, photographs, and what appeared to be architectural drawings. But underneath those, taking up most of the chest's space, were canvas bags that clinked with unmistakable metallic sound. I began, afraid to voice what I was thinking. "Silver dollars," Carlos confirmed with a grin. "Your grandfather collected them for 60 years, never trusted banks completely, always kept part of his savings in precious metal. There's probably $40,000 worth in there, maybe more at current silver prices." $40,000. Enough to fight Kenneth's legal challenge, enough to renovate the property, enough to start the bakery I'd dreamed about since childhood. But more than the money, the chest contained something even more valuable. Evidence that Grandpa had planned for this moment, had prepared for my arrival, had believed in my future, even when I'd stopped believing in it myself. "There's more," Rosa said, lifting out a leather portfolio. "Business plans, supplier contacts, even preliminary designs for converting the grain storage building into a commercial bakery. Your grandfather researched everything: health department requirements, licensing procedures, equipment supplier. He spent 5 years preparing for the day you'd finally come home." Tears streamed down my face as I looked through documents that represented not just financial security but something far more precious:
absolute faith in my potential. Grandpa had seen past my corporate job and safe choices to the dreams I'd buried beneath practical concerns. He'd known that someday the vultures would circle, and he'd prepared a treasure chest that would give me the tools to fight back and the resources to build the life I'd always wanted. How did he know? I whispered. How did he know I'd need this? Because he knew Kenneth, Rosa said simply, and because he knew you. He used to say that his granddaughter had inherited his entrepreneurial spirit, but needed to remember how to trust herself. He said the corporate world was like a cage that made you forget you could fly. As we climbed back up from the root cellar, the setting sun was painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in years, I could picture a future that belonged entirely to me. Early mornings filled with the smell of baking bread, afternoons spent learning traditional techniques from Rosa and Carlos, evenings planning and dreaming instead of just surviving. Uncle Kenneth and Cousin Derek thought they'd stolen my inheritance, but they'd only taken the obvious part, the house and land that appeared on legal documents. They had no idea about the real treasure Grandpa had left me, hidden in a root cellar in a town they'd never heard of, guarded by people who'd been waiting 40 years for me to come home. Tomorrow I would call Izzy Santos and begin the legal process of defending my rightful inheritance. I would start learning everything Rosa and Carlos could teach me about traditional baking and running a small business. I would begin the long, patient work of converting Grandpa's dreams into reality. But tonight, as I sat on the portal of my adobe house, watching stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The vultures had circled, thinking they were stealing my inheritance. Instead, they'd accidentally set me free to discover what Grandpa had known all along, that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for someone brave enough to dig beneath the surface and claim their true legacy. Uncle Kenneth was about to learn that Henry Brooks had raised a granddaughter who was much stronger than she looked, much smarter than he'd given her credit for, and much more prepared for this fight than he could possibly imagine. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time in my adult life, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to win. The first week in San Miguel de Valle unfolded like pages from a book I'd never known I wanted to read. Rosa appeared at my door each morning at 5:30, carrying thermoses of strong coffee and paper bags filled with still warm pastries that served as both breakfast and gentle bribes to coax me from my warm bed into the cool mountain air. The adobe house held heat poorly in the desert climate, and I'd spent my first few nights shivering under thin blankets, unused to the dramatic temperature swings that characterized high desert living. "Misha, you need proper bedding," Rosa declared on my third morning, surveying my pitiful nest of hotel towels and sweatshirts. "And warmer clothes. Mountain mornings don't care that it's almost summer." She led me to a small general store run by an elderly man named Don Esteban, whose weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he selected wool blankets woven in traditional patterns. The prices were remarkably reasonable compared to Denver retail, and when I tried to pay full price, Don Esteban waved away my extra bills with a dismissive gesture. "Henry's granddaughter pays family rates," he said in careful English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "Your grandfather helped my nephew get into college. We don't forget kindness in this town." This casual mention of Grandpa's generosity toward local families became a recurring theme as I gradually integrated into village life. At the small post office, the clerk mentioned how Henry had co-signed a loan for her son's truck. The mechanic who checked my ancient Honda's transmission recalled how my grandfather had helped organize a fundraiser when medical bills threatened to bankrupt a neighbor. Everywhere I went, people shared stories about small acts of kindness that had rippled through their community for decades. "He never talked about any of this," I told Rosa as we walked back to the bakery, my arms full of wool blankets and practical work clothes. "In Denver, he seemed like just a quiet old man who read history books and complained about modern technology." Rosa's laugh was knowing. "Your grandfather was a different person here. In Denver, he was playing a role the city required. Here, he could be himself. He understood that communities survive because people take care of each other, not because they compete with each other." The contrast with my Denver life, where I'd barely known my neighbors' names despite living in the same building for 3 years, was stark. Here, walking through town meant stopping for conversations with shopkeepers, receiving invitations to family celebrations, being asked for opinions on everything from local politics to recipe modification. The pace was slower but somehow more demanding, requiring a level of social engagement that my urban anonymity had never required. Carlos began my education in traditional bread making that same week, starting with the fundamentals of sourdough starter maintenance. The culture he gave me had been kept alive for over a century, passed down through generations of bakers who understood that some knowledge couldn't be learned from books or videos.
It required daily attention, careful observation, and the kind of intuitive understanding that developed only through repetition and failure. This starter is older than my grandmother, he explained, showing me how to assess its health by smell and texture. During the Depression, families shared pieces of their starters with neighbors who couldn't afford commercial yeast. It kept entire communities fed when times were hard. My first attempts at bread were spectacular failure. I overproofed the dough, misjudged oven temperatures, and produced loaves that ranged from dense bricks to collapsed pancakes. Carlos watched my frustrations with patient amusement, occasionally offering gentle corrections, but mostly letting me learn through trial and error. "You're thinking too much," he said on my 5th day, watching me obsess over precise measurements and timing. "Bread doesn't care about your schedule or your anxiety. It rises when it's ready, bakes when the oven is right, and tastes good when you stop trying to control every variable." This philosophy of patient observation rather than rigid control was revolutionary for someone who'd spent years in corporate environments where everything was scheduled, measured, and optimized for efficiency. Learning to read dough by touch, to judge doneness by smell, to adjust techniques based on humidity and altitude required a different kind of intelligence than I'd used in my accounting career. The breakthrough came during my 2nd week, when I finally produced a loaf that earned Carlos's approving nod. The crust was golden and crisp, the crumb had the proper balance of chewiness and lightness, and the flavor carried hints of the wood smoke from the traditional oven. More importantly, I'd made it without constantly checking recipes or second-guessing every decision. "Now you're beginning to understand," Carlos said, breaking off a piece to taste. "Baking isn't about following rules perfectly. It's about developing a relationship with your ingredients and trusting your instincts." Rosa's lessons focused on the business side of artisanal food production, areas where my corporate background actually proved useful. She kept meticulous records of costs, sales, and seasonal variations, but her bookkeeping system was a mixture of handwritten ledgers and intuitive knowledge that would have horrified my former accounting supervisor. "We need to track everything for taxes and permits," she explained, showing me her filing system. "But we also need to understand our community. Mrs. Valdez always orders extra bread for her grandson's visits. The Herrera family increases their standing order before every church celebration. Father Miguel likes the sourdough rolls but won't admit it because he thinks they're too fancy." This intimate knowledge of customer preferences and community rhythms was entirely different from the anonymous transactions I'd processed in Denver. Here, every sale was also a social interaction, every regular customer a neighbor whose life circumstances affected their purchasing patterns. Rosa knew when families were struggling financially and quietly offered day-old bread at reduced price. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and special dietary needs without consulting any database. "How do you keep track of it all?" I asked, watching her seamlessly manage a dozen different customer relationships during the busy morning rush. "Practice," she said simply, "and caring about people instead of just their money. When you see customers as neighbors instead of transactions, remembering their needs becomes natural." My evenings were spent in the grain storage building that would eventually become my bakery, assessing what needed to be done to convert the space for commercial food production. The traditional bread ovens were magnificent, massive adobe structures with thick walls and carefully designed chambers that could maintain steady heat for hours. Carlos had restored them beautifully, but the rest of the building required significant work. Isabella Santos joined me for these planning sessions, bringing her legal expertise and artistic eye to the renovation discussion. The permitting process for commercial food production was complex, requiring upgrades to plumbing, electrical systems, and ventilation that would cost thousands of dollars. But Isabella had researched every requirement and identified cost-effective solutions that would satisfy health department regulations without breaking my budget. "The key is phasing the work intelligently," she explained, sketching layouts on graph paper. "Start with the minimum upgrades needed for basic permits, then expand as your business grows. You don't need a fully equipped commercial kitchen on day one." Her practical approach extended to marketing strategies that leveraged the town's growing reputation as a destination for cultural tourism. San Miguel de Valla's traditional architecture and artisanal crafts were beginning to attract visitors from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, creating opportunities for specialty food businesses that emphasized authentic techniques and local ingredients. "Food tourism is exploding in northern New Mexico," Isabella said, showing me statistics she'd researched. "People drive hours to experience genuine traditional foods made by real artists. You're not just opening a bakery, you're preserving cultural heritage and creating an authentic experience that visitors can't get anywhere else." The business plan that emerged from our discussions was both ambitious and realistic. Phase 1 would focus on supplying bread to local restaurants and grocery stores, building a reputation for quality while keeping overhead costs manageable. Phase 2 would add retail sales and custom orders for special events. Phase 3 would incorporate cooking classes and cultural workshops that could attract tourists willing to pay premium prices for authentic experiences. Your grandfather's research was incredibly thorough, Isabella noted, reviewing the documents from the root cellar. He identified every potential revenue stream and researched the market demand for each one. This isn't just a dream, it's a viable business plan backed by solid financial projections. The silver dollars from Grandpa's treasure chest provided more than enough capital for the initial phase, but I was determined to supplement that foundation with modern marketing techniques that could expand our reach beyond the local community. My corporate experience with spreadsheets and data analysis, skills I'd thought were irrelevant to artisanal baking, proved invaluable for developing systems to track costs, optimize production schedules, and identify the most profitable product line. You're bringing something unique to this traditional craft, Rosa observed, watching me create digital inventory systems that could predict demand based on seasonal patterns and local events. Your grandfather was smart to send someone who understands both the old ways and the new possibilities. 3 weeks into my residency, I encountered my first serious challenge when a health inspector arrived unannounced to assess the property for commercial food production permits. The inspector, a stern woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Rodriguez, had clearly dealt with many hopeful entrepreneurs whose dreams exceeded their understanding of regulatory requirements. "This is a residential property," she noted, consulting her clipboard. "Converting to commercial use requires extensive modifications that many people underestimate. The failure rate for small food businesses is extremely high, especially for people without restaurant experience." I walked her through the renovation plans Isabella and I had developed, explaining how each modification would address specific health code requirements. My corporate background in regulatory compliance proved helpful as I discussed documentation procedures, temperature monitoring systems, and contamination prevention protocols with technical precision that seemed to surprise her. "You've obviously done your research," Rodriguez admitted, examining the traditional bread ovens with professional interest. "These hornos are actually ideal for artisanal baking if they're properly maintained. The thermal mass provides more consistent heat than most commercial ovens." Her preliminary assessment identified several areas that needed attention: upgraded hand washing stations, improved ventilation in the prep areas, and professional-grade refrigeration for ingredient storage, but nothing that couldn't be addressed within my budget. More importantly, she seemed genuinely enthusiastic about supporting a business that would preserve traditional food preparation methods. "We need more operations like this," she said, completing her inspection note. "Industrial food production is efficient, but it's eliminating cultural knowledge that took generations to develop. What you're proposing helps preserve that heritage, while meeting modern safety standards." The permit approval process would take several weeks, but Rodriguez's preliminary endorsement gave me confidence that the regulatory hurdles were manageable. Isabella had prepared thoroughly, and my corporate experience with bureaucratic procedures helped me navigate the documentation requirements without the frustration that derailed many small business applications. "One obstacle cleared," Isabella said when I called to report the inspection result. "Now we can start the serious renovation work while the paperwork moves through the system." Carlos recommended a local contractor named Miguel Sandoval, whose family had been building and restoring adobe structures for 4 generations. Miguel's crew understood traditional construction techniques while incorporating modern utilities in ways that respected the building's historical character. Their estimate for the essential upgrades was reasonable, and they could complete the work in phases that wouldn't disrupt my ongoing education in bread making. "We start with the fundamentals," Miguel explained, surveying the grain storage building with an experienced eye: electrical, plumbing, and ventilation systems that meet code requirements. Then we focus on workspace layout that maximizes its efficiency while preserving the building's traditional character. The renovation work began during my 4th week in San Miguel de Valle, transforming the quiet mornings into a symphony of construction sounds, hammering, drilling, and the occasional colorful commentary when stubborn components refused to cooperate. I continued my daily lessons with Rosa and Carlos, but afternoons were spent working alongside Miguel's crew, learning basic construction skills while staying closely involved in every decision. "Sweat equity," Miguel called it, watching me struggle to install outlet covers with unpracticed hands. "Every hour you invest in this building increases your connection to it. When you're working 18-hour days during peak season, you'll appreciate understanding how everything fits together." The physical work was exhausting but satisfying in ways my office job had never been. Each completed task represented visible progress toward a concrete goal, and the skills I was learning would be valuable for ongoing maintenance and future expansion. My hands developed calluses, my shoulders gained strength, and my back adapted to the constant bending and lifting that construction work required. "You're changing," Rosa observed one evening, watching me roll out dough with movements that were becoming more confident and efficient. "Not just your technique, but your whole presence. You stand differently now, move with more purpose." She was right. The timid uncertainty that had characterized my first days in San Miguel de Valle was gradually being replaced by growing confidence in my abilities and decisions. Each small success, a perfect loaf of bread, a successful permit application, a construction problem solved through creative thinking, reinforced my belief that this dramatic life change had been the right choice. My evenings were spent in the main house, which was slowly becoming home as I added personal touches and practical improvement. The thick adobe walls kept the interior cool during increasingly warm days, and the traditional construction methods, that had seemed primitive at first, began to make sense as I experienced their advantages firsthand.
Don Esteban had recommended a local woman named Carmen Herrera, who specialized in traditional textiles, and she helped me select rugs, cushions, and wall hangings that complemented the house's architectural character, while providing necessary comfort and color. Carmen's workshop was a treasure trove of hand-woven goods, created using techniques passed down through generations of Hispanic and Native American craftspeople. "Your grandfather always said this house needed a woman's touch," Carmen said, arranging textiles that transformed stark adobe walls into warm, welcoming spaces. "He kept it clean and functional, but he never made it feel like home. He was waiting for you to do that." These constant reminders of Grandpa's long-term planning for my eventual arrival continued to amaze me. Every conversation with longtime residents revealed another way he'd prepared for my transition to this new life. From maintaining relationships with potential mentors, to researching business opportunities, to ensuring the property remained in perfect condition for my use. "How long did he expect me to stay in Denver?" I asked Rosa during one of our morning coffee sessions. "Some of these preparations go back years. He never lost faith that you'd eventually find your way here," Rosa replied. "But he also understood that some people need to try other paths before they're ready to accept their true calling. He said the corporate world would teach you valuable skills, but eventually it would also teach you what you didn't want from life." Grandpa's patient confidence in my eventual awakening was humbling and inspiring. While I'd been struggling through years of unfulfilling work and gradually diminishing dreams, he'd been quietly building a foundation for the life he knew I'd eventually want to create. His faith in my potential had never wavered, even when my own confidence had nearly disappeared. The fifth week brought my first real test of the skills I'd been developing when Rosa asked me to handle the Saturday farmers market alone while she attended her nephew's wedding in Albuquerque. The prospect of managing customer interactions, handling money, and representing the bakery's reputation without supervision triggered anxiety that reminded me uncomfortably of my corporate presentation nerves. "You're ready," Rosa assured me, reviewing the inventory and pricing one final time. "Trust your training and remember that these are your neighbors, not adversarial customers looking for reasons to complain. They want you to succeed." The market setup began before dawn, loading Rosa's aging pickup truck with tables, canopies, and carefully packed bread products that represented hours of early morning work. The town plaza gradually filled with other vendors, farmers with early vegetables, artisans displaying pottery and jewelry, ranchers selling grass-fed beef and fresh eggs. The community aspect of market day was as important as the commercial transactions, providing opportunities for neighbors to catch up on news and plan collaborative projects. My first customers were reassuringly familiar. Father Miguel selecting his weekly sourdough rolls, Valdez picking up extra loaves for her visiting grandchildren, and Don Esteban sampling a new variety of sweet bread I'd suggested to Rosa. Their friendly encouragement and patient acceptance of my nervous handling of change and credit card transactions helped build confidence for the more challenging interactions that followed. The real test came when a tour bus from Santa Fe disgorged 24 visitors, seeking authentic local experiences and Instagram-worthy photo opportunities. These customers had different expectations than local regulars, asking detailed questions about ingredients, preparation methods, and cultural significance, while photographing everything from the traditional packaging to the historic plaza setting. "Is this really made in wood-fired oven?" asked a well-dressed woman whose designer hiking outfit suggested limited experience with actual outdoor activities.
Because we visited another place that claimed to be traditional but was obviously using modern equipment. I found myself drawing on knowledge gained from weeks of intensive education, explaining the thermal properties of adobe construction, the flavor differences between wood-fired and gas baking, and the historical significance of horno ovens in Hispanic colonial community. My corporate presentation skills proved unexpectedly relevant as I fielded questions about ingredients, production methods, and local food traditions with a confidence. "You really know your stuff," commented a man who'd been skeptical about paying premium prices for peasant bread. "Most places just have teenagers working the stands who can't tell you anything beyond the price." The tour group's enthusiasm translated into substantial sales that exceeded Rosa's typical Saturday revenue. But more importantly, their genuine appreciation for the cultural knowledge I'd absorbed reinforced my growing sense of belonging in this community. I wasn't just selling bread. I was sharing stories, preserving traditions, and connecting visitors with authentic experiences they couldn't find in commercial establishments. "How did it go?" Rosa asked when she returned Sunday evening, finding me surrounded by empty inventory containers and a cash box containing more money than usual. "Better than I expected," I replied, showing her the sales figures and describing my interactions with both regular customers and tourists. I actually enjoyed explaining the traditional methods and cultural history. It felt like I was doing something meaningful instead of just processing transactions. Rosa's smile was warm with approval and something that looked remarkably like pride. "That's exactly what your grandfather hoped would happen. He said you needed work that engaged your mind and your values, not just your ability to follow procedures." The success of that market day marked a turning point in my confidence and sense of purpose. For the first time since arriving in San Miguel de Valle, I could envision myself not just surviving this dramatic life change, but thriving in ways that had been impossible in my previous career. The skills I was developing weren't just technical, they were social, cultural, and entrepreneurial capabilities that could support a meaningful and profitable business. Week 6 brought new challenges as the bakery renovation entered its final phase, and I began preparing for my first attempts at commercial-scale production. The upgraded electrical system could support professional mixing equipment. The new ventilation system would handle increased heat and humidity from expanded baking operations, and the improved workspace layout would allow for efficient production flows that could meet growing demand. Carlos introduced me to suppliers who could provide organic flour, locally sourced grains, and specialty ingredients that would differentiate my products from industrial bakeries. These relationships required different skills than corporate vendor management. Personal connections based on shared values and mutual support rather than contract negotiations focused solely on price and delivery terms. "Pedro Marquez grows the best wheat in 3 counties, Carlos explained, introducing me to a farmer whose organic grain operations supplied several artisanal bakeries throughout northern New Mexico. His great-grandfather developed varieties specifically adapted to our altitude and climate. The flavor is incomparable, but he only works with bakers who understand the value of traditional grains." Pedro's farm visit was an education in agricultural heritage and sustainable farming practices that complemented my growing understanding of traditional food preparation. His wheat varieties had been selected over generations for flavor rather than yield, resulting in grains that produced bread with complex tastes and superior nutritional profiles, compared to commercial alternatives. "Industrial agriculture optimizes for profit margins," Pedro explained, showing me heritage wheat varieties that required more careful handling, but produced superior results. "Traditional farming optimizes for quality and sustainability. The difference is obvious when you taste the final product." These supplier relationships were investments in quality that would justify premium pricing while supporting local agriculture and traditional practices. My business model wasn't competing with industrial bakeries on price. It was offering superior products that reflected authentic craftsmanship and cultural heritage that mass production couldn't replicate. The approaching completion of my apprenticeship with Rosa and Carlos coincided with the final permit approvals that would allow me to begin independent commercial operation. Isabella had navigated the bureaucratic requirements with skill and persistence, ensuring that all regulatory hurdles were cleared before my planned opening date. "Everything's approved," she announced, presenting me with official documents that authorized commercial food production at my property. "You can start operations as soon as the final health inspection is completed." Ms. Rodriguez scheduled that for next week.
The reality of actually opening my own business was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. 6 weeks earlier, I'd been processing other people's financial transactions in a Denver office building, dreaming about someday having the courage to pursue my own goal. Now I was days away from launching an enterprise that would depend entirely on my skills, judgment, and ability to serve my community's needs. Nervous? Rosa asked, watching me review inventory lists and production schedules for the 100th time. That's normal. Every entrepreneur questions whether they're really ready when the moment of truth arrives. What if I fail? I admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger as my opening date approached. What if I've romanticized this whole lifestyle and I don't actually have what it takes to succeed? Rosa's expression was patient and understanding. Misha, you've already succeeded in ways you don't even recognize. 6 weeks ago, you were a refugee from corporate misery, with no practical skills and no confidence in your ability. Today, you're a competent baker who understands traditional techniques, a business owner who's navigated complex permit processes, and a community member who's earned respect through hard work and genuine engagement. Her words reminded me of how much I'd changed during my intensive education in San Miguel de Valle. The timid woman who'd arrived with 2 duffel bags and a head full of doubts had been replaced by someone who could hold technical discussions with health inspectors, negotiate with suppliers, and explain cultural traditions to curious tourists with growing authority and enthusiasm. Besides, Carlos added with a grin, failure isn't permanent unless you give up completely. Every successful baker has produced thousands of terrible loaves while learning their craft. The difference between success and failure is persistence, not perfection. Their confidence in my abilities was reinforced by the broader community's enthusiasm for my upcoming opening. Word had spread throughout the valley that Henry's granddaughter was finally ready to transform his property into the bakery he'd always envisioned, and anticipation was building among potential customers who remembered my grandfather's stories about traditional bread making and cultural preservation. The whole town is excited, Father Miguel told me after Sunday Mass, where I'd become a regular attendee more for social connections than religious conviction. Your grandfather talked for years about his granddaughter who would someday bring traditional baking back to our community. People have been waiting to see his vision become reality. This community support was both encouraging and intimidating, creating expectations that I hoped my skills and products could meet. But the pressure was balanced by genuine affection and desire to see me succeed, along with patience for the inevitable learning curve that would accompany my transition from apprentice to independent business owner. The final week before my official opening was a whirlwind of last-minute preparations, final inspections and test productions, designed to identify potential problems before paying customers arrived. Ms. Rodriguez's health inspection was thorough but encouraging, finding only minor issues that could be easily corrected. The traditional bread ovens performed flawlessly, producing consistent results that met professional standards while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that made artisanal baking special. You're ready, she concluded, signing off on permits that authorized full commercial operation. This is one of the most professional small bakery setups I've inspected. Your grandfather would be proud of what you've accomplished. As I stood in my renovated workspace, surrounded by professional equipment and traditional ovens that bridged centuries of baking knowledge, I felt a deep sense of connection to something larger than personal ambition. This wasn't just about starting a business, it was about preserving cultural heritage, supporting sustainable agriculture, and creating authentic experiences that enriched both producers and consumers. The frightened corporate refugee who'd fled Denver 6 weeks earlier had discovered strengths and capabilities she'd never known she possessed. Tomorrow, those abilities would be tested in the marketplace, where success would depend not on following someone else's procedures but on my own judgment, skills, and understanding of community needs. Uncle Kenneth and cousin Derek had thought they were stealing my inheritance when they challenged Grandpa's will. Instead, they'd accidentally launched me toward the life I'd always been meant to live, surrounded by people who valued authentic craftsmanship over financial manipulation, in a place where success was measured by community contribution rather than individual accumulation. The real treasure hadn't been the silver dollars or the property deed. It had been the opportunity to discover who I could become when I stopped accepting other people's limitations and started pursuing my own possibility. Tomorrow's opening would mark not just the beginning of my business, but the completion of my transformation from someone who processed other people's dreams into someone who created her own reality. Grandpa's final gift hadn't been money or property.
It had been the chance to remember that sometimes the most valuable inheritances are the ones that can't be stolen because they exist within the person who's brave enough to claim them. The morning of my bakery's official opening arrived with the kind of crisp mountain air that made every breath feel like a promise. I woke at 3:30, my body automatically responding to rhythms established during weeks of training with Rosa and Carlo. The pre-dawn darkness felt familiar now, no longer the alien territory it had seemed during my first week in San Miguel de Valle. This was baker's time, the sacred hours when ovens warmed and dough transformed into sustenance for the community. My hands moved through the opening rituals with growing confidence, checking the sourdough starters that bubbled quietly in their ceramic crocks, assessing the moisture content of flour that Pedro Marquez had delivered fresh from his mill, calculating quantities based on expected demand from restaurants and individual customers who had already placed orders. The mathematics of commercial baking were more complex than the simple loaves I'd practiced during my apprenticeship, requiring precise scaling to ensure consistent quality while minimizing weight. The traditional bread ovens had been heating since midnight, their thermal mass slowly absorbing energy from carefully selected wood that would impart subtle flavors to the day's production. Carlos had taught me to read the oven's readiness through visual cues: the color of the interior walls, the behavior of flour sprinkled on the hearth, the sound of steam when water droplets hit the heated surface. These ancient diagnostic methods were more reliable than modern thermometers, connecting me to generations of bakers who had worked with similar tools and techniques. My first commercial batch consisted of basic sourdough loaves that had become my signature during market day sales, along with specialty rolls flavored with green chiles and cheese that reflected local taste. The dough had been prepared the previous evening, developing flavor and structure through slow fermentation that industrial bakeries couldn't replicate with their accelerated processes. Each loaf represented hours of patient attention, from starter maintenance through final shaping and scoring. The familiar anxiety of performance evaluation crept through my concentration as I loaded the first batch into the oven. These weren't practice loaves that would be shared among friends and mentors. They were products that paying customers would judge, compare to alternatives, and either recommend to others or quietly avoid in future purchases. The difference between amateur enthusiasm and professional competence would be revealed in the next few hours as my bread baked and cooled, developing the characteristics that would determine my reputation in the community. Rosa arrived as scheduled at 5:30, carrying her usual thermos of coffee and a reassuring smile that had become my daily source of courage. She moved through my workspace with practiced efficiency, checking temperatures, examining dough consistency, and offering subtle corrections to techniques that were still developing. Her presence provided both technical expertise and emotional support, bridging the gap between my nervous independence and the confidence that would eventually come with experience. "Everything looks perfect," she said, watching me score the final batch of loaves with patterns that would guide their expansion during baking. "Your grandfather would be amazed to see how quickly you've mastered techniques that took me years to develop." The comparison to Grandpa Henry brought unexpected tears to my eyes. 6 months earlier, he'd been a living connection to family history and childhood dreams. Now he existed only in memories and the legacy he'd carefully constructed for my eventual arrival in San Miguel de Valle. His physical absence felt particularly acute during this milestone moment, when his encouragement and validation would have meant everything to my fragile confidence. "He's here in spirit," Rosa added gently, recognizing my emotional response. "Every time you use techniques he researched, every time you serve customers he told stories about, every time you make decisions based on values he instilled, he's participating in your success." The morning's first customers began arriving at 7, drawn by aromas that drifted from the bakery's open windows and attracted attention throughout the valley. Don Esteban was predictably punctual, selecting his weekly assortment with the careful consideration of someone who understood the relationship between quality ingredients and superior results. Miss Valdez followed closely, her usual order supplemented by extra items for a family celebration that would showcase my products to relatives visiting from Albuquerque. "Smells even better than Rosa's place," Don Esteban commented, though his loyalty to the Adobe bakery remained unshaken. "Competition will keep both of you sharp and give customers more choices. Good for everyone." His diplomatic approach to what could have been an awkward competitive situation reflected the community's sophisticated understanding of economic relationships. Rather than viewing my bakery as a threat to Rosa's established business, local residents recognized that multiple artisanal food producers would enhance the town's reputation and attract more visitors who would benefit all merchants and service providers. The stream of customers continued throughout the morning, creating a steady rhythm of transactions that tested both my product quality and customer service skills. Each interaction required balancing efficiency with the personal attention that differentiated small-town commerce from anonymous urban retail experiences. Customers expected to discuss ingredient sources, preparation methods, and cultural significance while also receiving prompt service that respected their time constraints. Father Miguel arrived during the mid-morning lull, his presence lending implicit community endorsement to my venture. His order was modest but symbolic, a single loaf of the sourdough that had become my signature product, and his public consumption of my bread during church gatherings would signal official acceptance to any remaining skeptic. Your grandfather always said this valley needed more young people willing to preserve traditional skills, he said, examining the loaf's crust with professional appreciation. Too many leave for cities and never return. Thank you for choosing to stay and contribute to our community's future. His words carried particular weight, because Father Miguel had witnessed decades of demographic changes that threatened rural communities throughout northern New Mexico. Young people typically left for educational and employment opportunities in larger cities, rarely returning with skills and resources that could strengthen local economy. My decision to invest in traditional food production represented a reversal of that pattern, offering hope that cultural heritage could be preserved through economic viability rather than museum preservation. The lunch rush brought different challenges as restaurant customers arrived to collect standing orders that would be incorporated into their daily special. These commercial accounts required larger quantities, consistent quality and reliable delivery schedules that would test my production planning and time management skills. The relationships were also more complex, involving credit terms, quality guarantees, and ongoing communication about menu planning and seasonal availability. Antonio Gutierrez, who owned a respected restaurant in the county seat, had placed the largest order, 24 artisanal rolls that would accompany his establishment's signature green chile stew. His standards were exacting, reflecting professional experience and customer expectations that demanded consistency from all suppliers. The rolls he collected that morning would be evaluated not just by taste but by appearance, texture and ability to complement other menu items without overwhelming delicate flavors. These are exceptional, he said after examining several rolls with the critical eye of someone whose reputation depended on ingredient quality. Better than the commercial products I've been using, and the traditional preparation will appeal to customers who appreciate authentic regional cuisine. His approval carried particular significance, because restaurant endorsements could generate substantial word-of-mouth marketing among food enthusiasts who trusted professional chefs' ingredient selection. A successful relationship with Antonio's restaurant could lead to additional commercial accounts throughout the region, providing the stable revenue base that would support seasonal variations in retail sales. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors when a tour bus from Santa Fe disgorged 30 passengers seeking authentic cultural experiences during their northern New Mexico excursion. These customers had different expectations than local residents, requiring educational explanations about traditional techniques, historical context, and cultural significance that transformed simple transactions into informal workshops about regional food heritage. "Is this really made the same way Spanish colonists used?" asked a woman whose expensive camera suggested serious interest in documenting authentic experiences. "Because we've visited several places that claimed to be traditional but were obviously using modern shortcuts." I found myself drawing on knowledge accumulated during weeks of intensive study with Rosa, Carlos, and various community elders who had shared family recipes and preparation techniques passed down through generations. The questions challenged me to articulate not just practical methods, but cultural meanings that gave traditional foods their significance beyond mere sustenance. "The techniques are essentially unchanged from colonial period," I explained, showing photographs of historical hornos while describing thermal properties that made wood-fired baking superior to modern alternatives. "What we've added are modern safety procedures and documentation requirements, but the fundamental processes remain identical to methods used by my customers' great-grandmother." The tour group's enthusiasm translated into substantial sales that exceeded my most optimistic projections for a single afternoon. More importantly, their obvious appreciation for both products and cultural education reinforced my growing understanding that I wasn't just selling bread. I was preserving and sharing heritage knowledge that had value beyond its commercial application. "You should consider offering formal classes," suggested the tour guide, who had observed similar educational programs at other artisanal food operations throughout the Southwest. There's growing demand for hands-on cultural experiences that teach traditional skills rather than just displaying historical artifacts. This suggestion aligned with business expansion ideas that Isabella Santos and I had discussed during our planning session. Cooking classes and cultural workshops could provide additional revenue streams while serving the educational mission that gave my work deeper meaning than simple commercial transactions. The combination of traditional skills instruction and authentic food production could attract visitors willing to pay premium prices for transformative experience. Evening brought time for reflection as I cleaned equipment, organized tomorrow's preparation lists, and calculated the day's financial result. The cash register total exceeded my conservative projections, but more importantly, customer feedback suggested that product quality met professional standards while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that justified artisanal pricing. Rosa returned as I completed closing procedures, her presence providing both practical assistance and emotional support during what had been an exhausting but triumphant day. We worked together in comfortable silence, our movements synchronized by weeks of shared training and mutual respect that had evolved into genuine friendship. "How do you feel?" she asked as we secured the building and prepared to head home for well-deserved rest. "Tired but satisfied," I replied, surprised by the accuracy of that simple assessment. "Like I've finally found work that uses all of my abilities instead of just fragments of what I can contribute." The contrast with my former corporate position was stark and revealing. In Denver, I'd utilized perhaps 20% of my capabilities processing other people's financial data without engaging creativity, cultural knowledge, or entrepreneurial instincts that were now proving essential to my success. The exhaustion I felt after my first day of independent business operation was completely different from the soul-crushing fatigue that had characterized my accounting career. "Your grandfather knew this would happen," Rosa said as we walked through the quiet plaza toward our respective homes. "He understood that you needed work that challenged your mind, engaged your values, and connected you to something larger than individual achievement." Grandpa Henry's prescient understanding of my psychological needs continued to amaze me. While I'd been unconsciously struggling against the constraints of corporate employment, he'd been patiently constructing an alternative that would address not just financial security but personal fulfillment and community contribution that gave work deeper meaning than mere survival. The following weeks established rhythms that balanced production demands with ongoing learning and business development. My daily schedule began at 3:30 with starter maintenance and dough preparation, continued through morning baking and customer service, and concluded with afternoon planning and equipment maintenance that prepared for the next cycle. The physical demands were substantial, but the work engaged both body and mind in ways that generated energy rather than depleting it. Customer relationships deepened as initial curiosity evolved into routine patronage, based on consistent quality and personal service that acknowledged individual preferences and family traditions. Mrs. Valdez's weekly orders increased as her extended family discovered my products during Sunday gatherings. Don Esteban began special ordering items for his own family celebrations, trusting my judgment about quantities and varieties that would complement traditional New Mexican feast preparation.
"You're becoming part of the community's rhythm," Carlos observed during one of our weekly consultation sessions, where he continued providing technical advice and emotional support as I navigated the challenges of independent business ownership. "When people start depending on your products for their family traditions, you've achieved something more valuable than simple commercial success." This integration into community life required understanding social dynamics and cultural expectations that extended far beyond commercial transactions. My bakery wasn't just a business, it was a cultural institution that supported traditions, celebrations, and daily routines that connected residents to their heritage and each other. The responsibility was both humbling and inspiring, creating accountability that motivated excellence while providing meaning that transcended profit margins. Restaurant accounts expanded as word spread among professional chefs about the quality and consistency of my products. 2 additional establishments began regular orders, and several others requested samples for menu development that could incorporate artisanal breads into their signature dishes. These commercial relationships required different skills than retail customer service, involving price negotiations, delivery schedules, and quality specifications that reflected professional standards and business realities. "You're developing a reputation beyond our immediate area,"
Isabella Santos reported during one of our monthly business review meetings. I've heard positive comments from restaurant owners in 3 different counties. That kind of word-of-mouth marketing is invaluable for building sustainable commercial accounts. The expanding customer base created opportunities for product line extensions that could increase revenue while showcasing the versatility of traditional techniques. Seasonal specialties using local ingredients, pumpkin breads in autumn, green chill and cheese combinations during harvest season, sweetbreads for holiday celebrations, demonstrated creativity while respecting cultural traditions that gave products authentic connections to regional identity. My 3rd month of operations coincided with the town's annual Harvest Festival, an event that attracted visitors from throughout northern New Mexico and provided opportunities for artisanal food producers to showcase their specialties to larger audiences. The festival committee invited me to participate with a booth that would feature both retail sales and educational demonstrations of traditional bread-making techniques. "This is your debut on the regional stage," Rosa explained as we planned my festival participation. "Success here could lead to wholesale opportunities and tourism partnerships that would support significant business expansion." The festival preparation required scaling up production to meet anticipated demand while maintaining quality standards that would reflect positively on my emerging reputation. The traditional bread ovens proved capable of handling increased volume, but the additional work required temporary assistance from community members who volunteered their time in exchange for learning opportunities in festival participation. Carmen Herrera, the textile artist who had helped furnish my home, organized a group of women who were interested in learning traditional bread-making techniques while supporting a community member's business venture. Their assistance was invaluable, but it also required developing teaching skills and supervisory abilities that extended my capabilities beyond individual production work. "You're becoming a teacher as well as a baker," Carmen observed, watching me explain scoring techniques to volunteers who were preparing decorative loaves for the festival display. "That's exactly what your grandfather hoped would happen, preserving knowledge by sharing it rather than hoarding trade secrets." The educational aspect of my work was emerging as one of its most rewarding dimensions. Each explanation of traditional techniques, each demonstration of cultural connections between food and community identity, each moment of successful knowledge transfer created ripple effects that extended my influence far beyond individual transactions. I was helping preserve cultural heritage while building a sustainable business model that could support ongoing tradition maintenance. Festival weekend brought challenges that tested every aspect of my developing expertise. The booth setup required pre-dawn preparation, loading vehicles with display materials, products and demonstration equipment that would showcase traditional techniques for curious visitors. The physical demands were substantial, but community volunteers provided essential assistance while gaining valuable experience in event management and customer service. The morning crowd included many familiar faces: local residents who wanted to support my festival debut, regular customers introducing visiting relatives to my products, and community leaders whose presence signaled official endorsement of my contributions to regional cultural preservation. Their support provided emotional encouragement and practical assistance as I navigated the complexities of managing a festival booth while maintaining product quality and customer service standards. "Look at this line," Don Esteban commented with obvious pride, pointing to the queue of visitors waiting to purchase bread and observe my baking demonstrations. "Half the festival wants to try your products. Your grandfather would be amazed to see how quickly you've built this reputation." The demonstration sessions attracted particularly enthusiastic audiences as visitors watched traditional techniques that most had never witnessed firsthand. My explanations covered historical context, cultural significance, and practical methods that connected contemporary food production to centuries of regional heritage. The educational component differentiated my booth from simple commercial vendors, creating experiences that justified premium pricing while serving broader cultural preservation missions. "This is exactly what we need more of," commented a cultural preservation specialist from the state tourism department, who had been observing my demonstrations with professional interest. "Authentic educational experiences that teach traditional skills rather than just displaying historical artifacts." Have you considered applying for cultural heritage grants that could support expansion of your educational program? This suggestion opened new possibilities for business development that could provide additional revenue streams while advancing cultural preservation goals that gave my work deeper meaning than simple commercial success. Grant funding could support equipment purchases, facility improvements, and program development that would enhance both educational offerings and production capability. The festival's second day brought media attention when a food writer for a regional magazine included my booth in her coverage of traditional food producers throughout northern New Mexico. Her article would reach audiences far beyond the immediate region, potentially attracting customers and wholesale opportunities that could support significant business expansion. "You're representing more than just your individual business," the writer explained as she interviewed me about traditional techniques and cultural preservation goals. You're part of a movement to maintain heritage knowledge while building economically viable enterprises that can compete with industrial food production. This broader context gave my work significance that extended beyond personal achievement or community contribution to regional and potentially national cultural preservation efforts. The combination of traditional techniques, authentic ingredients, and educational mission created a model that could be replicated by other entrepreneurs seeking to balance cultural heritage maintenance with economic sustainability. Festival weekend concluded with sales figures that exceeded my most optimistic projections and customer feedback that validated both product quality and educational value. More importantly, the event had established my reputation beyond the immediate community while demonstrating that traditional food production could attract substantial audiences when presented with appropriate cultural context and educational content. "You've graduated," Rosa said as we cleaned up after the festival's conclusion. "From local baker to regional cultural ambassador, your grandfather's vision is becoming reality faster than any of us expected." The weeks following the Harvest Festival brought new opportunities and challenges as increased visibility translated into wholesale inquiries, special event orders, and educational program requests that stretched my capabilities in exciting but demanding directions. Restaurant accounts expanded to include establishments in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, requiring production increases and delivery logistics that tested my operational system. Isabella Santos helped develop contracts and pricing structures that reflected the true value of artisanal products, while remaining competitive with commercial alternatives. The legal frameworks protected both quality standards and business interests, ensuring that growth wouldn't compromise the cultural authenticity that differentiated my products from mass-produced alternatives. "You're building something unique," Isabella observed during one of our business planning sessions. "An enterprise that succeeds commercially while advancing cultural preservation goals that benefit the entire region. That combination is rare and valuable." The educational component of my work continued expanding as requests arrived for cooking classes, cultural workshops, and demonstration programs that could serve schools, community organizations, and tourism groups seeking authentic heritage experience. These programs required developing curriculum materials, safety procedures, and group management skills that extended my abilities far beyond individual bread production. Teaching is becoming as important as baking, I realized during a workshop for visiting culinary students who wanted to learn traditional techniques for potential incorporation into their professional careers. Knowledge preservation requires active sharing, not just personal mastery. This insight reflected my growing understanding of the broader mission that gave my work significance beyond commercial success. Each student who learned traditional techniques, each visitor who gained appreciation for cultural heritage, each customer who supported artisanal production over industrial alternatives contributed to preservation efforts that would benefit future generations. The approaching holiday season presented opportunities for product line expansion that could showcase traditional celebration foods while serving community needs for authentic cultural expression. Sweetbreads, ceremonial items, and seasonal specialties required research into historical recipes and preparation methods that connected contemporary celebrations to ancestral traditions. December orders are already exceeding last year's total at the Adobe Bakery, Rosa reported, sharing information that helped me project demand and plan production schedule. The combination of local customers and regional reputation is creating opportunities neither of us could handle individually. This collaborative rather than competitive relationship with Rosa's established business reflected the mature economic understanding that characterized successful rural communities. Rather than viewing each other as threats, we recognized that multiple artisanal food producers enhance the region's reputation while providing customers with choices that serve different preferences and occasions. My first 6 months of independent operation concluded with financial results that exceeded projections while establishing foundations for sustainable growth and cultural impact that gave my work meaning beyond personal achievement. The terrified corporate refugee who had fled Denver with 2 duffel bags and a head full of doubts had been transformed into a confident entrepreneur whose products served her community while preserving heritage knowledge for future generations. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal, cultural, and spiritual in ways that touched every aspect of my existence. The work that filled my days engaged creativity, cultural knowledge, and entrepreneurial instincts that had been dormant during years of corporate employment. The community that surrounded my efforts provided social connections and mutual support that replaced the isolation and competition that had characterized my urban lifestyle. Uncle Kenneth and cousin Derek had believed they were stealing my inheritance when they challenged Grandad's will, but their betrayal had actually launched me toward discoveries that no legal document could have conveyed. The real treasure hadn't been property or money.
It had been the opportunity to uncover capabilities and create a life that aligned with values and dreams that corporate conformity had nearly extinguished. Standing in my bakery as another successful day concluded, surrounded by equipment that would produce tomorrow's bread and planning materials that projected future growth, I felt profound gratitude for the betrayal that had seemed so devastating just months earlier. Sometimes the cruelest actions yield the most beautiful results when they force people to discover strengths they never knew they possessed and pursue dreams they never thought they could achieve. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, buried among promotional messages and routine business correspondence that I typically handle during the quiet afternoon hours between lunch service and evening preparation. The sender's name made my coffee mug pause halfway to my lips, Kenneth Brooks, with a subject line that read Family Reconciliation and Business Opportunity. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the message, months of peaceful routine suddenly disrupted by unwelcome memories of the confrontation that had launched my journey to San Miguel de Valle. Dear Natalie, the message began with a tone of forced civility that I recognized from childhood family gatherings. I hope this letter finds you well and thriving in your new venture. Recent business associates have brought to my attention that you've established quite a reputation for artisanal baking in northern New Mexico. As family members, Derek and I feel it's time to move past our previous misunderstanding and explore opportunities for mutual benefit. The casual dismissal of their legal assault as a misunderstanding revealed the same manipulative tactics that had characterized their behavior during my grandfather's estate dispute. But something in the tone suggested desperation beneath the corporate politeness, a subtle shift from the confident aggression they displayed during our last encounter. The restaurant industry has always fascinated me, the email continued, and I believe there may be synergies between your traditional baking operation and my established catering business. Perhaps we could discuss a partnership arrangement that would provide you with expanded market access while giving our clients authentic regional specialties. I'll be traveling through your area next week for other business and would welcome the opportunity to visit your facility and discuss possibilities. I read the message 3 times before the full implications sank in. Kenneth wasn't challenging my ownership anymore. He was proposing partnership, acknowledging my success and positioning himself as a potential collaborator rather than an adversary. The shift was so complete that I wondered if this was the same man who had threatened legal action and questioned my competence just months earlier. Rosa found me staring at my laptop screen when she arrived for our weekly consultation session, her experienced eyes immediately recognizing distress signals that I'd hoped to conceal. Without being asked, she moved to the coffee pot and poured 2 cups while settling into the chair across from my desk. Bad news from the outside world? She asked gently, her tone conveying readiness to listen without pushing for details I might not want to share. I turned the laptop toward her, watching her expression change as she read Kenneth's message. Her face remained carefully neutral, but I could see the anger building behind her eyes as she processed the presumptuous tone and transparent opportunism. Your uncle has remarkable timing, she said finally, her voice carrying layers of meaning that I was still learning to interpret. Just as your business achieves regional recognition and financial success, family members who challenged your inheritance suddenly want to become partners. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. For months, Kenneth and Derek had argued that I was incompetent to manage my grandfather's legacy, that my dreams of opening a bakery were childish fantasies doomed to failure. Now that those same ventures had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, they wanted to claim partnership in achievements they'd actively tried to prevent. What do you think he really wants? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Rosa's smile was knowing and slightly predatory. Money, obviously, but also control. Men like your uncle can't tolerate success they didn't orchestrate, especially when it comes from people they've underestimated. Partnership is just another word for gradual takeover. Her assessment aligned with my own instincts about Kenneth's motivations, but hearing it articulated so clearly helped crystallize thoughts that had been swirling chaotically since I'd opened his email. This wasn't about family reconciliation or genuine business collaboration. It was about appropriating success that threatened his narrative about my capabilities and worthiness. He mentions that business associates brought your reputation to his attention, Rosa continued, studying the email more carefully. That suggests he's been monitoring your progress, probably hoping to find evidence of failure he could use to justify his original position. Instead, he discovered success that undermines everything he claimed about your competence. The idea that Kenneth had been watching my progress from Denver, waiting for me to validate his predictions of failure, was both disturbing and strangely satisfying. Instead of the collapse he'd anticipated, he'd witnessed a transformation that challenged every assumption he'd made about my character and capability. Isabella Santos arrived for our scheduled business meeting as Rosa and I were discussing response strategies,
her legal training immediately recognizing the significance of Kenneth's email when we shared its content. She read the message with the careful attention she brought to all potentially problematic communications, her expression growing more skeptical with each paragraph. "This is classic predatory behavior," she said, settling into a chair and pulling out her legal pad. "Wait for someone else to do the hard work of building a successful enterprise. Then position yourself as a necessary partner who can provide access to markets and resources the original entrepreneur supposedly lacks." Isabella's analysis cut to the heart of what made Kenneth's proposal so offensive. He was offering solutions to problems I didn't have, positioning himself as essential to continued growth that was already happening through my own efforts and community relationships. "The restaurant connections he mentions are probably legitimate," Isabella continued, "but they come with strings attached that would gradually shift control away from you toward his established business interests. Partnership agreements can be structured to favor silent partners who contribute capital over active partners who provide labor and expertise." This warning reminded me of conversations with other small business owners who had accepted investment or partnership arrangements that initially seemed beneficial but eventually resulted in loss of creative control and decision-making authority. The promise of expanded markets and increased revenue often masked gradual erosion of entrepreneurial independence. "What if I simply ignore the email?" I asked, though I suspected avoidance wouldn't solve anything. "That won't make him go away," Rosa said with certainty born of experience. "Men like your uncle interpret silence as weakness or fear. If you don't respond, he'll escalate until he forces a confrontation on terms more favorable to him." Isabella nodded agreement while making notes on her legal pad. "Better to control the timing and circumstances of any meeting. Respond professionally but set clear boundaries about what you're willing to discuss and what you're not." Their advice made sense strategically, but emotionally I recoiled from the prospect of facing Kenneth again. Our last encounter had ended with my flight to New Mexico and months of rebuilding confidence that his presence might undermine. The woman who had discovered strength in traditional baking and community acceptance felt vulnerable to psychological manipulation that had controlled her for years. "You're not the same person who ran away from Denver," Rosa said, apparently reading my thoughts. "Kenneth has no idea who you've become or what you've accomplished. He's still operating from assumptions about the frightened corporate drone he bullied 6 months ago." Her words reminded me of how completely my self-perception had changed during my intensive education in traditional skills and community integration. The terrified refugee who had arrived with 2 duffel bags and no plan had been replaced by a confident entrepreneur whose products served regional customers while preserving cultural heritage. Kenneth's power over me had depended on my acceptance of his judgments about my capabilities and worthiness, acceptance I no longer felt. "Besides," Isabella added with a slight smile, "you have advantages now that you didn't have during your last confrontation. Legal documentation of your legitimate ownership, a successful business that validates your competence, and community support that confirms your value to people who actually know your character and contribution." The contrast between my current position and the isolation I'd felt during Kenneth's original challenge was dramatic and empowering. Then I'd been alone and financially vulnerable, dependent on distant family relationships that provided no real support. Now I was embedded in a community that valued my contributions and surrounded by people who had witnessed my transformation from frightened exile to successful entrepreneur. We crafted a response that acknowledged Kenneth's email while establishing clear boundaries about any potential meeting. I agreed to a brief conversation during his supposed business trip, but only in a public setting with witnesses present, and only to discuss his proposal rather than negotiate specific terms. The message was polite but firm, conveying confidence without aggression while making clear that I wasn't intimidated by his sudden interest and collaboration. "Perfect tone," Isabella said, reviewing the draft response. "Professional enough to avoid giving him ammunition for future complaints, but strong enough to establish that you're not the pushover he remembers from Denver." The week before Kenneth's scheduled visit passed in a haze of nervous energy that I channeled into intensive preparation for our confrontation. I reviewed financial records that documented my business success, organized customer testimonials that validated my reputation, and prepared talking points that would counter any attempts to minimize my achievements or question my competence. Rosa and Carlos provided emotional support while helping me practice responses to predictable challenges Kenneth might raise. Their confidence in my abilities was reassuring, but they also understood the psychological dynamics that made family confrontations particularly difficult for people who had been conditioned to accept criticism and doubt their own judgment. "Remember that his opinion of your success doesn't change the reality of what you've accomplished," Carlos said during one of our practice sessions. "Your customers don't care what your uncle thinks about your business model. Your suppliers don't need his approval to continue working with you. Your community doesn't require his permission to value your contributions. This reminder helped separate Kenneth's potential psychological impact from his actual ability to affect my business operation. His disapproval might be emotionally uncomfortable, but it had no practical power over the relationships and reputation I'd built through months of consistent performance and community engagement. The morning of Kenneth's visit arrived with the kind of bright mountain sunshine that made everything seem possible and hopeful. I chose my clothing carefully, professional enough to command respect, practical enough to reflect my working lifestyle, traditional enough to signal my commitment to regional cultural values. The woman Kenneth would meet bore little resemblance to the corporate drone he'd intimidated in Denver. Isabella accompanied me to the meeting at Rosa's Bakery, her legal training and community standing providing both practical support and symbolic reinforcement of my local connection. Rosa had closed the bakery to regular customers for an hour, creating a private setting that was nevertheless public enough to prevent any attempt at intimidation or manipulation. Kenneth arrived precisely on time, driving a rental car that screamed urban affluence and cultural disconnection from rural New Mexico. His expensive suit and manicured appearance contrasted sharply with the authentic regional atmosphere of the Adobe Bakery, immediately marking him as an outsider whose values and priorities differed fundamentally from local residents. Derek accompanied him, as I'd expected, his presence serving as both emotional support for his father and witness to whatever transpired during our conversation. Both men seemed surprised by the setting and the presence of Isabella, whose role they hadn't anticipated when planning their strategy for this encounter. Nathalie, Kenneth began with forced warmth, extending a hand that I shook briefly before stepping back to maintain distance. You look wonderful. Rural life obviously agrees with you. The condescending tone suggested that my improved appearance was somehow accidental rather than the result of meaningful work and community integration. His casual dismissal of my transformation as simply rural life revealed the same inability to recognize my agency and accomplishment that had characterized his original challenge to my inheritance. Thank you, I replied neutrally, gesturing toward the table where Rosa had arranged coffee and samples of both our bakery's products. I understand you wanted to discuss business opportunities. Derek's eyes were already cataloging the bakery's equipment and calculating potential revenue streams, his entrepreneurial instincts automatically assessing any operation he encountered. His expression suggested surprised respect for the professional quality of Rosa's setup, though he was clearly still forming opinions about my own venture. Impressive operation, Kenneth said, accepting coffee while examining the displayed bread products with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Your reputation for quality certainly seems deserved. I've spoken with several restaurant owners who use your products exclusively for their bread service. This admission that he'd been researching my customer base confirmed Rosa's suspicion that his interest wasn't coincidental but represented systematic monitoring of my progress. The revelation was both flattering and disturbing, suggesting that my success had achieved sufficient prominence to warrant investigation by people who had initially dismissed it as impossible. The market for authentic regional foods is expanding rapidly, Derek added, apparently taking his cue from his father's opening comments. Consumers are increasingly willing to pay premium prices for products with genuine cultural connections and artisanal production methods. His analysis was accurate but felt like an attempt to claim expertise about trends I'd discovered through direct experience rather than market research. The implication was that my success had been accidentally fortuitous rather than the result of careful planning and skilled execution. Which brings us to our proposal, Kenneth continued, leaning forward with the focused intensity I remembered from family business discussions during my childhood. Your operation has proven the market demand, but individual producers face limitations that partnerships can overcome. Distribution networks, marketing resources, capital for expansion. These are areas where established businesses like mine can provide significant value. Isabella took notes while I processed Kenneth's pitch, her legal training automatically identifying potential problems with the partnership structure he was implying.
His emphasis on resources I supposedly lacked revealed the same patronizing attitude that had characterized his original challenge to my competence. What specific partnership arrangement did you have in mind? I asked, keeping my voice steady despite rising anger at his presumptuous tone. Kenneth and Derek exchanged glances before Derek pulled out a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be preliminary legal documents. The preparation suggested they'd anticipated favorable reception for their proposal and come prepared to move quickly toward formal agreements. We're proposing a distribution partnership that would give you access to restaurant markets throughout Colorado and surrounding states, Derek explained, sliding papers across the table. In exchange for exclusive rights to your products outside New Mexico, we would provide marketing support, logistics coordination, and capital for production scaling. Isabella's pen moved rapidly as she noted key terms while I struggled to process the audacious scope of their proposal. They weren't suggesting minor collaboration. They wanted exclusive control over my products in markets that represented potential expansion opportunities I might pursue independently. Exclusive rights? I repeated, my voice sharper than intended. You want to control where I can sell my own products? Not control, Kenneth corrected with the smoothness that characterized his most manipulative moments. Partnership. We handle external markets while you focus on local operations and production quality. Division of labor that plays to everyone's strengths. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the fundamental power imbalance he was proposing. Under his arrangement, I would become a production contractor for his distribution business rather than an independent entrepreneur with control over my own commercial destiny. And what happens if our partnership doesn't work out? I asked, studying the documents that Isabella was reviewing with obvious concern. How would I regain access to markets you've developed using my products? Derek's smile was confident and slightly condescending. That's why we structure these agreements carefully to prevent conflicts from arising. Clear expectations, defined responsibilities, built-in incentives for mutual success. His non-answer confirmed my suspicion that their partnership terms were designed to make withdrawal difficult or impossible once they'd established control over external distribution channels. The arrangement would create dependency that could be leveraged to extract increasingly favorable terms over time. Rosa had remained silent during the initial presentation, but her expression conveyed skepticism that bordered on hostility. When Kenneth paused in his pitch to sample one of her pastries, she finally spoke with deceptive mildness. Interesting proposal, but I'm curious about something. 6 months ago, you were arguing that Natalie was too incompetent to manage her grandfather's property. Now you want to partner with the same business venture you claimed was doomed to failure. What changed your assessment of her capability? The directness of her question caught both men off guard, their rehearsed presentations clearly not having anticipated challenges to their previous positions. Kenneth's face flushed slightly while Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Family disagreements often involve emotions that cloud business judgment. Kenneth replied after a pause, his diplomatic tone not quite concealing underlying irritation. With time and perspective, it becomes easier to evaluate opportunities objectively. Rosa's smile was sharp and knowing. So your legal challenge to Henry's will was based on emotion rather than objective assessment of Natalie's competence. That's a remarkable admission from someone asking to be trusted with business partnership. Isabella looked up from the legal documents with barely concealed amusement, clearly appreciating Rosa's tactical skill in exposing the contradictions in Kenneth's position. The two women had obviously coordinated their approach to this confrontation, combining legal expertise with community knowledge to protect my interests. Perhaps we should focus on current opportunities rather than relitigating past family disputes, Derek interjected, attempting to redirect the conversation away from increasingly uncomfortable territory. But past behavior is the best predictor of future conduct, Isabella said smoothly, setting down her pen with deliberate precision. These partnership documents contain clauses that would give you remarkable control over Natalie's business operation, including veto power over product development and pricing decisions. For someone who recently questioned her business judgment, you're asking for extraordinary trust. The legal analysis that followed was devastating to Kenneth's proposal, as Isabella systematically identified provisions that would gradually transfer control of my business to his organization while providing minimal protections for my interests. Her professional expertise made their attempted manipulation transparent and indefensible. Most concerning is the termination clause, Isabella continued, pointing to specific language in the contract. If the partnership dissolves for any reason, you retain exclusive rights to all product formulations, customer lists, and marketing materials developed during the partnership period. Essentially, Natalie would be starting over while you keep everything valuable that emerged from the collaboration. Kenneth's composure was beginning to crack under the systematic dismantling of his proposal, his confident businessman persona revealing the entitled family member who had tried to steal my inheritance through legal intimidation. These are standard terms in distribution partnerships, he insisted, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Risk allocation requires commensurate protections for the party making the larger financial investment. But you're not making the larger investment, I said, finally finding my voice after listening to Isabella's analysis. I've invested months of intensive labor learning traditional techniques, thousands of dollars in equipment and renovation costs,
and established the customer relationships that create market demand. You're proposing to capitalize on my investments while claiming protection from risks I've already assumed. The clarity of my response surprised even me, reflecting confidence and analytical ability that had been dormant during my corporate career but had flourished during months of independent business operation. Kenneth's patronizing assumptions about my competence were colliding with evidence of capabilities he'd never recognized or acknowledged. Furthermore, Rosa added, Natalie doesn't need external distribution networks to access restaurant markets in Colorado. I've already received inquiries from Denver establishments interested in carrying authentic New Mexican artisanal products. She can develop those relationships independently without surrendering control to intermediaries. This revelation was news to me. But Rosa's timing was perfect for undermining Kenneth's central premise that I needed his resources to achieve expansion I couldn't accomplish alone. Her strategic revelation demonstrated the community support and market opportunities that made his partnership proposal unnecessary rather than essential. Derek's expression had shifted from confident salesmanship to barely concealed frustration as their carefully planned presentation collapsed under scrutiny from people who understood both business law and market realities better than they'd anticipated. Look, he said, abandoning diplomatic pretense, we're offering a legitimate opportunity for mutual benefit. If you're not interested, just say so instead of nitpicking standard business terms. I'm not nitpicking, I replied, my voice steady despite the familiar attempt to dismiss my concerns as unreasonable. I'm protecting myself from a partnership arrangement that would give you control over my business while providing minimal benefits I couldn't achieve independently. The confrontation that followed revealed the true nature of their proposal as Kenneth's facade of respectful collaboration crumbled under the pressure of having his terms analyzed by competent advisors. His familiar tactics of intimidation and manipulation were ineffective against someone who was no longer isolated and financially vulnerable. This is exactly what I expected, Kenneth said, his tone shifting to angry disappointment. You've been influenced by these people to reject family support in favor of provincial thinking that will limit your potential. The attempted division between my community relationships and family loyalty was transparent and insulting, revealing his continued inability to recognize my agency in making decisions based on my own interests rather than external influence. My potential isn't limited by people who've invested months in teaching me valuable skills, I replied, anger finally breaking through diplomatic restraint. It's limited by people who want to control my success without acknowledging my contributions to creating it. Rosa and Isabella flanked me as the meeting deteriorated into the kind of family confrontation I'd fled Denver to avoid, but their presence provided emotional support that transformed the dynamic completely. Instead of facing Kenneth's manipulation alone, I was backed by people who understood my actual capabilities and valued my genuine contributions to their community. You're making a mistake that you'll regret, Derek said as they prepared to leave, his parting shot reflecting wounded pride more than genuine concern for my welfare. Small operations like this have natural limitations that prevent sustainable growth. Eventually you'll need the kind of resources and connections we could have provided. Maybe, I replied, walking them toward the door with deliberate calm. But I'd rather succeed or fail based on my own decisions than surrender control to people who've already demonstrated they don't understand or respect my judgment. Kenneth's final look combined disappointment with something that might have been respect, as if he was finally recognizing the transformation that months of independent success had created in someone he'd systematically understood. After they left, the three of us sat in silence for several minutes, processing the confrontation and its implications for my continued independence. The relief of having survived their manipulation attempt was tempered by awareness that they might try other approaches to appropriate success they couldn't recreate independently. Well, Rosa said finally, that went better than I expected. They came prepared to intimidate an isolated small business owner, and instead encountered a confident entrepreneur backed by knowledgeable advisors and community support. Isabella was reviewing her notes from the meeting, already considering potential legal challenges that might emerge from Kenneth's frustrated ambitions. Their partnership proposal was so one-sided that it suggests desperation rather than confidence. Someone who's truly successful doesn't need to appropriate other people's achievements. The insight was revealing and reassuring, confirming my instinct that Kenneth's sudden interest in collaboration reflected weakness rather than strength. His established business apparently needed my authentic products and regional reputation more than I needed his distribution networks and capital resources. What happens now? I asked, though I suspected the answer would depend on Kenneth's response to having his proposal rejected so decisively. Now you continue building the business you've created, Rosa said firmly.
Independent success is the best protection against future manipulation attempts. The stronger your operation becomes, the less attractive you are as a target for people who want to control rather than collaborate. Her advice aligned with my own instincts about maintaining the independence that had been so hard-won during months of intensive learning and community integration. Kenneth's proposal had been designed to make me dependent on his resources, while surrendering control over decisions that affected my daily work and long-term goals. Besides, Isabella added with a smile, their visit just confirmed that your success is substantial enough to attract attention from people who initially dismissed it as impossible. That's actually flattering, even if their intentions were problematic. The meeting's conclusion left me feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized, drained by the emotional demands of confronting family manipulation but strengthened by having successfully defended my independence with support from people who understood my actual capabilities and contributions. Kenneth and Derek's defeat marked not just the failure of their specific partnership proposal, but the collapse of their broader narrative about my incompetence and dependence on their approval. The transformation they'd witnessed during our confrontation had forced them to acknowledge success they'd predicted was impossible, undermining every assumption they'd made about my character and potential. Walking back to my bakery that afternoon, I felt the profound satisfaction of having completed a journey that began with their theft of my inheritance and concluded with their unsuccessful attempt to appropriate the success that theft had accidentally enabled. The frightened corporate refugee, who had fled Denver with nothing but dreams and determination, had become someone strong enough to reject manipulation from people who had once controlled her through fear and financial dependence. Tomorrow would bring the familiar rhythms of bread production, customer service, and business development that filled my days with meaningful work and community connection. Kenneth's visit had been an unwelcome disruption, but it had also provided confirmation that the life I'd built in San Miguel de Valle was not only sustainable but successful enough to attract envious attention from people who had never believed in my potential. The real victory wasn't rejecting their partnership proposal, it was having become someone who could recognize manipulation and defend herself against it with confidence, knowledge, and community support that no family betrayal could ever take away. 3 weeks after Kenneth's failed partnership ambush, I received a phone call that would test everything I'd learned about standing up for myself and protecting the life I'd built. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Chen, an attorney representing what she described as concerned family members, who had questions about my business practices and their potential impact on my grandfather's estate. Miss Brooks, I'm calling regarding some irregularities that have come to our attention concerning the commercial use of property that may still be subject to ongoing probate disputes, she said in the crisp professional tone that had once intimidated me during my corporate days. My clients believe there may have been premature conversion of residential property to commercial use without proper estate authorization. The legal language was deliberately obscure, but the threat was clear enough. Kenneth had escalated from failed partnership negotiations to direct legal attack, apparently hoping that expensive attorneys and procedural challenges could accomplish what manipulation and intimidation had failed to achieve. The familiar knot of anxiety began forming in my stomach as childhood patterns of fear and compliance reasserted themselves despite months of growing confidence. I'm not sure I understand your concerns, I managed, though my voice carried less conviction than I'd hoped. The property ownership was settled through proper probate procedures months ago, and all business permits were obtained through legitimate channels. Margaret's laugh was coldly professional. Probate settlements can be reopened when new evidence suggests improper procedures or undisclosed assets that affect distribution calculation. My clients have reason to believe that certain property valuations may have been deliberately understated to avoid proper tax assessments and family notification requirements. The accusation was vague enough to avoid specific claims while creating uncertainty about the legal foundation of everything I'd accomplished since arriving in San Miguel de Valle. Kenneth was apparently betting that the mere threat of renewed legal challenges would be sufficient to force compliance with his demands for partnership or shared control. What exactly are your clients' requests? I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve surrendering either ownership or operational control to resolve their manufactured concerns. At minimum, we need comprehensive financial records documenting all commercial activities conducted on the disputed property, Margaret replied. Additionally, my clients require assurance that any ongoing business operations are properly bonded and insured to protect estate interests from potential liability exposure. The demands were designed to be expensive and time-consuming while providing pretexts for ongoing interference in my business operation. Even if I complied completely, Kenneth could manufacture additional concerns that would justify continued legal harassment,
until I capitulated to his partnership demands or sold the property to escape the constant pressure. Isabella Santos was reviewing Margaret Chen's follow-up letter when I arrived at her office the next morning, my hands shaking slightly as I carried coffee that had grown cold during my anxious drive through the mountain curve. Isabella's expression was professionally calm, but I could see the anger building behind her careful neutrality as she analyzed the latest legal threat. "This is harassment disguised as legitimate legal inquiry," she said finally, setting down the letter with deliberate precision. "Every claim they're making was already addressed during the original probate proceedings. They're hoping you don't understand that settled estates can't be reopened without extraordinary circumstances that clearly don't exist here." Her confident assessment should have been reassuring, but years of conditioning to defer to authority figures made it difficult to trust my own judgment against professional legal threats, even when those threats were baseless. The frightened corporate employee who had spent years avoiding conflict was reasserting herself despite months of growing confidence and independence. "What if they're right about something I missed?" I asked, voicing the self-doubt that Kenneth's tactics were designed to exploit. "What if there really are irregularities that could affect my ownership?" Isabella's smile was both gentle and fierce, the expression of someone who had watched me grow stronger over the past months and refused to let me retreat into old patterns of fear and compliance. "Natalie, I handled your grandfather's estate personally. Every document was filed correctly, every requirement was met, every asset was properly valuated and distributed according to his explicit instructions. Their claims have no legal merit." The reminder of Isabella's direct involvement in the original proceedings provided some reassurance, but emotional certainty was harder to achieve than intellectual understanding. Kenneth knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to reactivate the anxiety and self-doubt that had controlled me for years before my transformation in San Miguel de Valle. "Besides," Isabella continued, "harassment campaigns like this are expensive to maintain and difficult to justify to state bar associations that monitor attorney conduct. Margaret Chen is walking a very fine line between zealous advocacy and frivolous litigation that could jeopardize her professional standing." This insight into the legal profession's self-regulation mechanisms was new information that helped contextualize Kenneth's strategy. He was betting that the cost and stress of defending against baseless claims would be sufficient to achieve his goals without having to prove his allegations in court where they would inevitably fail. Rosa arrived at Isabella's office during our discussion, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from legal analysis to community support that surrounded me with people who understood my actual capabilities and contribution. Her expression was thunderous, as Isabella summarized Kenneth's latest escalation, her protective instincts clearly aroused by threats against someone she'd invested months in teaching and mentoring. "Enough is enough," Rosa declared with finality that brooked no argument. "This man has been harassing you for almost a year, first trying to steal your inheritance, then demanding partnership in your success, and now inventing legal problems to force compliance with his demands. It's time to stop playing defense and start fighting back." Her militant attitude was both inspiring and slightly terrifying, suggesting courses of action that my conflict-avoidant nature instinctively resisted. But months of working alongside Rosa had taught me that her strategic thinking was usually sound, even when her proposed tactics seemed aggressive to someone who had spent years avoiding confrontation. "What kind of fighting back did you have in mind?" I asked, though I suspected her answer would involve public exposure of Kenneth's harassment campaign. Rosa's smile was sharp and predatory, the expression of someone who had defended her community against various threats over the decades and knew how to mobilize collective resources against individual aggressors. "This valley has a long memory for people who try to exploit or manipulate our residents. Word spreads quickly when outsiders attempt to cause problems for community members who contribute positively to our shared life." Isabella nodded agreement, while making notes about potential countermeasures that could shift the dynamic from defensive response to proactive protection of my interests. "We could file harassment complaints with both the Colorado and New Mexico bar associations, documenting the pattern of baseless legal threats designed to extort compliance rather than address legitimate concern." The prospect of taking offensive action against Kenneth's harassment felt both liberating and terrifying, representing a fundamental shift from victim mentality to assertive self-protection that my corporate conditioning had never encouraged. But months of building confidence through successful business operation and community integration had provided psychological resources that made such assertiveness possible. "There's something else," Rosa added, her expression becoming more serious. "Father Miguel mentioned that Kenneth has been making inquiries about other property owners in the valley, asking questions about land values and development potential that suggest broader ambitions than just harassing you. This revelation transformed Kenneth's harassment from personal vendetta into potential threat to the entire community that had welcomed and supported my transformation. The man who had dismissed rural New Mexico as primitive and backward was apparently investigating opportunities to exploit the region's growing reputation for cultural tourism and artisanal production. If he's targeting other community members, then this becomes a collective defense issue rather than individual harassment, Isabella said, her legal training immediately recognizing the broader implication. Community organizations have resources and standing that individual property owners lack when defending against outside manipulation. The afternoon was spent developing a comprehensive response strategy that combined legal documentation, community mobilization, and public exposure to transform Kenneth from predator to pariah whose harassment tactics would become public knowledge throughout the region. The plan was more aggressive than anything I would have contemplated during my corporate days, but months of discovering inner strength had prepared me for confrontations that previous conditioning would have made impossible. Father Miguel arrived as we were finalizing our strategy, his presence lending moral authority to actions that might have seemed vindictive if motivated purely by personal grievance. His involvement signaled community endorsement of defensive measures that protected not just my interests, but broader values of mutual support and resistance to external exploitation. Kenneth Brooks contacted several parishioners this week, Father Miguel reported, his usually gentle demeanor hardened by protective anger. He's been asking about property ownership, family situations, and financial circumstances that suggest he's looking for vulnerable targets who might be susceptible to manipulation or pressure tactics. The systematic nature of Kenneth's information gathering revealed ambitions that extended far beyond recovering his imagined losses from my inheritance dispute. He was apparently conducting reconnaissance for broader exploitation of community members who might lack the legal resources and support networks that had protected me from his harassment. "This is predatory behavior that threatens our entire community," Rosa declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped protect the valley against various threats over the decade. "We need to make it clear that outsiders who attempt to exploit or manipulate residents will face collective resistance that makes such tactics counterproductive." The meeting that followed brought together community leaders, business owners, and long-term residents who understood the importance of protecting their shared values against outside threat. The response to Kenneth's harassment campaign was swift, comprehensive, and more effective than any individual defensive measures could have been. Don Esteban organized a phone tree that spread information about Kenneth's tactics throughout the valley, ensuring that any future contact attempts would be met with informed resistance rather than vulnerable confusion. Carmen Herrera coordinated with other artisans to document their interactions with suspicious outsiders, creating a pattern of evidence that could support legal action if harassment continued. "Community defense is our strongest tradition," Don Esteban explained to those who hadn't experienced such collective action before. "When outside threats target individual members, we respond as a unified group that makes continued aggression costly and ineffective." The cultural lesson was powerful and moving, demonstrating values of mutual support and collective responsibility that had sustained rural communities through generations of external challenges. My individual struggle against Kenneth's harassment had become a community effort that reflected deeper principles about protecting vulnerable members from exploitation. Isabella filed formal complaints with multiple bar associations, documenting Kenneth's pattern of harassment and questionable legal tactics while requesting professional sanctions that could limit his ability to continue threatening community members. The complaints were carefully researched and professionally presented, carrying weight that individual grievances might have lacked. Legal harassment campaigns depend on victims being isolated and uninformed about their rights, Isabella explained as she prepared the final documentation. When targets have competent legal representation and community support, such tactics typically collapse because the costs exceed any potential benefit. The week following our community mobilization brought immediate results as Kenneth's harassment campaign encountered resistance he clearly hadn't anticipated. Margaret Chen's office received dozens of calls from Valley residents documenting suspicious inquiries and potential misconduct, creating a paper trail that undermined any claim that her client's actions were legitimate legal inquiry rather than calculated intimidation. More importantly, Kenneth's inquiries about other property owners were met with coordinated refusal to provide information, along with pointed questions about his motives that made clear his tactics were known and opposed throughout the community. The isolation and vulnerability he was trying to create had been replaced by collective awareness and mutual protection. "He called my office twice yesterday," Rosa reported during one of our daily check-ins, asking about property values and business relationships in terms that made it obvious he was fishing for leverage against community members. I told him that information wasn't available to outsiders with no legitimate business interests in our valley. The transformation of Kenneth from threatening authority figure to transparent nuisance was remarkable and liberating, demonstrating how quickly predatory behavior could be neutralized when targets were prepared and supported rather than isolated and vulnerable. The community response had shifted the power dynamic completely, making continued harassment costly rather than potentially profitable.
Margaret Chen's final communication arrived via certified mail 10 days after our community mobilization began, informing me that her clients had decided to pursue other avenues for resolving their concerns about estate administration. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the reality that Kenneth's harassment campaign had collapsed under scrutiny from people who understood both legal procedures and community defense tactics. Translation: they're giving up because continued harassment would cost more than any potential benefits, Isabella said, reviewing the letter with obvious satisfaction. Bar Association complaints, community resistance, and public documentation of their tactics made this approach counterproductive rather than intimidating. The victory felt complete and transformative, representing not just successful defense against Kenneth's harassment, but proof of the life I'd built in San Miguel de Valle could withstand external threats through community support and personal strength that had developed during months of intensive growth and learning. 6 months later, I stood in the expanded bakery facility that had grown from my original operation into a regional destination for authentic traditional foods and cultural education. The success that Kenneth had tried to appropriate and then destroy had flourished beyond anything I'd imagined when I first arrived in the valley with 2 duffel bags and a head full of fears. The morning rush included familiar faces whose daily routines had become intertwined with my business rhythms, along with tourists who had traveled hundreds of miles to experience authentic traditional baking and learn techniques that connected them to cultural heritage that industrial food production had nearly eliminated. Each customer represented not just commercial success but validation of choices that had seemed impossible during my corporate exile in Denver. Rosa emerged from the kitchen where she'd been teaching a cooking class to visitors from 3 different states, her face glowing with satisfaction that came from sharing knowledge and watching students discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Our friendship had evolved from mentor-student relationship into true partnership based on shared values and mutual respect that enriched both our lives. Another full class, she reported, wiping flour-dusted hands on the apron that had become her signature uniform. 2 students want to return next month with family members, and one is seriously considering opening her own traditional bakery in Colorado using techniques she learned here. The ripple effects of our educational programs continued to amaze and inspire me, creating connections that extended far beyond commercial transactions to genuine cultural transmission that preserved knowledge while supporting sustainable economic development. Each student who carried traditional techniques back to their home communities extended our impact in ways that no marketing campaign could have achieved. Your grandfather would be amazed, Rosa continued, gesturing toward the bustling activity that filled every corner of our expanded facility. He dreamed of preserving cultural knowledge through viable business operation, but I don't think even he imagined success on this scale. Grandpa Henry's vision had indeed exceeded his own expectations, evolving from personal rescue mission for his lost granddaughter into regional cultural preservation effort that attracted national attention from food writers, cultural historians, and sustainable agriculture advocates. The property he'd left me had become a model for authentic heritage tourism that benefited entire communities rather than just individual operators. Isabella Santos arrived for our monthly business review carrying news that would have seemed impossible during my early days of fearful uncertainty about Kenneth's legal challenges. A documentary production company wanted to feature our operation in a series about traditional food preservation and cultural sustainability, offering compensation that would fund additional facility expansion and educational program development. They're particularly interested in your personal transformation story, Isabella explained, reviewing the production company's proposal. Urban professional discovers authentic life through traditional skills and community integration. It's apparently a narrative that resonates with audiences who feel disconnected from meaningful work and genuine social relationships. The irony of Kenneth's harassment campaign having accidentally launched me toward national recognition wasn't lost on any of us. His attempts to steal my inheritance and then appropriate my success had ultimately strengthened both my personal resolve and community support networks that made larger achievements possible. What do you think Grandpa would say about all this?
I asked Rosa as we watched the documentary crew interview customers about their experiences with traditional food education and cultural preservation. Rosa's smile was warm and knowing, reflecting years of correspondence with my grandfather and deep understanding of his hopes for my eventual transformation. He'd say that sometimes the cruelest betrayals lead to the most beautiful discoveries when they force people to find strength they never knew they possessed. The truth of her words resonated through every aspect of my current life, from the confident competence that filled my daily work to the community relationships that provided social connection and mutual support I'd never experienced during my urban isolation. Kenneth's betrayal had indeed been the catalyst for discovering capabilities and creating a life that aligned with values and dreams my corporate conditioning had nearly extinguished. As evening settled over the valley, and the last tourist departed with shopping bags full of authentic traditional foods and heads full of cultural knowledge they would carry back to their home community, I reflected on the journey that had transformed a frightened corporate refugee into a confident entrepreneur whose work preserved cultural heritage while supporting sustainable economic development. The silver dollars from Grandpa's treasure chest had provided initial capital, but the real inheritance had been opportunity to discover who I could become when freed from other people's limitations and expectations. Kenneth and Derek had thought they were stealing my birthright when they challenged Grandpa's will, but they had actually freed me to claim a legacy that no legal document could have conveyed. The woman who stood in her successful bakery that evening, surrounded by evidence of achievement that had exceeded everyone's expectations, bore little resemblance to the timid corporate drone who had processed other people's financial transactions while dreaming about someday having the courage to pursue her own goal. The transformation had been complete and irreversible, creating strength and confidence that no external threat could ever diminish. Uncle Kenneth's final lesson had been unintentional but valuable, teaching me that the most precious inheritances are the ones that exist within people who are brave enough to claim them, strong enough to defend them, and wise enough to share them with communities that understand their true value. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the cruelest betrayals, waiting for someone with enough courage to transform loss into discovery and fear into strength. The bakery's traditional bread ovens would be warming before dawn tomorrow, ready to transform simple ingredients into sustenance for neighbors and visitors who had become part of an extended community that valued authentic craftsmanship over industrial efficiency, cultural preservation over corporate profit, and mutual support over individual competition. The work ahead would be challenging and rewarding in equal measure, filled with opportunities to continue growing while serving purposes larger than personal achievement. Grandpa Henry's granddaughter had finally come home to a life that honored both his legacy and her own potential. Surrounded by people who understood that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for someone with enough faith to dig beneath the surface and claim their true inheritance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.